To the elections in the United States now, the vote will be won by the candidate who secures the required 270 votes of the Electoral College. Unlike in South Africa, where the winner takes all, in the US, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris' fate will be determined by the number of votes allocated to each particular state. In this hotly contested election, let's look at media houses and if they can remain objective in reporting on candidates and parties. I'm joined by Professor Stephen Chan, who's a professor of world politics at the University of London. A very good evening to you, Professor Chan, and thanks for joining us. Let's take a look at some of these publications, these media houses who have now said they will not be endorsing presidential candidates as they've done in the past, such as the Washington Post and the LA Times.
There's controversy about that. The Washington Post has traditionally endorsed a candidate. Since the last election, the Washington Post, which is the most distinguished newspaper in the United States, has been bought by Elon Musk. And many people think that this is in fact editorial interference on the part of Musk to make sure that the Washington Post does not endorse Kamala Harris, Musk being a friend of Donald Trump. So the real problem in America is not that newspapers endorse candidates. That happens all the time. Happens here in the United Kingdom as well. The problem is very, very much whether or not proprietors of newspapers try to direct editorial opinion so there's no longer any objectivity in the editorial opinion. Newspapers like the Washington Post have traditionally been extremely stringent and rigorous in giving even-handed and honest reportage and analysis of elections, even while endorsing candidates.
And Professor Chan, you know, the former Washington editor also went on to social media and tweeted about this and saying that basically the newspaper is giving in to the Republican camp's intimidation. If we're looking at the idea of objectivity as well, would that not be for the betterment of the voter as well, to just have an objective and neutral report?
You know, the United States is such a pluralistic and often very, very divided country. It's actually several countries jammed into one called the United States. There are going to be so many different opinions, and the newspapers reflect that. The idea of objectivity, as we would understand it, doesn't exist in the same way in the United States. There's an awful lot of partisan politics, and that is reflected in newspapers. However, the really big newspaper titles, like the New York Times, like the Washington Post, like the LA Times, they're generally regarded as very, very serious in the way that they report objectively about candidates and the campaigns of candidates.
And while there hasn't been an official order to look at how many times or media houses have covered Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, do you think that had anything to do with it, that they may have seen a disproportionate amount of coverage on one candidate and not the other? And considering that Donald Trump is also seeing a media house for 10 billion rand in the US right now, post that 60-minute interview that Kamala Harris had there.
Basically, the role of media in the United States is very vexed. Many people don't read the newspapers at all. A very great deal of information these days is taken off social media with all of the biases and fakeries and deep fakeries that take place there. So you have a lot of, as it were, false news reporting. They call it fake news, although everyone maintains that their fake news is not fake. And what you've got is a lot of conspiracy theory, a lot of, as it were, trying to denigrate candidates. There's been an election of insults, an election of denigration. Policy discussion is not very, very high on the list of most people who are going out to vote. Now, in a newspaper like the Washington Post, for instance, what you do have is some of the world's best policy analysis. But as I said, most Americans are not wedded to their newspapers these days.
And while typically this has been going on in the UK and places like the US as well, where such newspapers would endorse a candidate, how does the endorsement affect the public's perception of media's impartiality?
Basically, as I said, there's a strong perception that a lot of news that comes through the traditional organs, like newspapers, particularly the prestigious newspapers, is fake. In other words, people want to believe what they believe. And anything that goes against their ingrained beliefs, their prejudices, their biases, is regarded as untrue. So you're having, as it were, a debate on the future of the Republic of the United States, which is not always based on factual evidence. The idea of evidence in an objective form is something which has, to a very large extent, dissipated in these elections. Alarmingly so, not just for this election, but for the future of democracy in the United States.
Where does that leave credible news and mainstream news when we're talking about a lot of times people getting their news no longer from traditional news outlets, but also from the palm of their hands and seeing the news that they want to see? Like you were saying now, people want to believe what they want to believe. And often when there's fake news on social media, that's when mainstream media or traditional media then comes into the equation to make sure that they vet whatever has been said, whether it's true or not. What happens to that role that the media plays?
That role may still be played. It's not necessarily going to be believed. That's the problem. There's a question of affiliation now, of faith in certain outlets like social media, telling the story, as we've been discussing, of people wanting to hear what they want to hear. And it's not that Americans don't just read the newspapers, some of which are very much world famous. They don't access the media of the rest of the world either. If you are looking at the distribution of hits on news sites like the BBC, like Al Jazeera, like France 24, all the big sites of the international community, you'll find that the American audience is disproportionately small compared with the size of the American population. So there's no sense of a cosmopolitan news feed in the USA either. Now, this does differ from state to state. It's a bit better in places like Washington, D.C. and New York, and it's absolutely difficult to detect a cosmopolitan approach to politics, particularly in the swing states. There's a few swing states that could decide this election. The real question is, what kind of information are the voters in those swing states getting? What are they believing? How will they therefore cast their votes? That's a big question which I think political scientists will be trying to disentangle for months and months after this election, no matter who wins.
Professor Chan, thank you so much for your time this evening and sharing your insights with us.